So in class, we've covered a couple of the different plant phyla. We talked about the non-vascular plants, that would be like phylum Bryophyta. We talked about the vascular seedless plants, so for example, phylum Lycophyta, and what we really focused on was phylum Pteridophyta. And then what this is going to cover are the seed plants. This includes both the Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, which you may be familiar with those terms. So let's talk about seed plants in general, whether it's a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. The first one is they don't need water for dispersal. So with our mosses and with our ferns, they really relied on water for sperm to move sperm from plant to plant. But seed plants found a way around that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Because they're able to disperse their seeds without the need of water, this means they can colonize many more habitats. Those seeds can be transported and then land somewhere else to then colonize an area. The seed itself is kind of a beneficial part of the plant. With spores, there's no nutrition and there's no protection there. But with a seed, and really depending on the type of seed, it'll be jam-packed with nutrients. It will prevent help create the seed, make sure it withstands harsh conditions. So for example, a coconut. Coconut has a really, really tough outer coating. That's going to protect the embryo that is inside. Because of that thick coating, it's also going to protect it, thinking about all the sand, so the friction from sand, also washing onto the waves and on the beach. So these seeds are designed to protect that embryo as much as possible and to give that embryo a leg up, to give it the opportunity to have nutrition for a higher reproductive success. Now finally, just a brief overview of the difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms. Both of them create seeds. The seeds more or less are pretty similar. However, gymnosperms, these would be like our pine trees, they have a naked seed, meaning their seeds are just released. There is no fruit. Our angiosperms make a fruit. Our angiosperms are also our flowering plants. And the fruit may or may not be obvious as to what it is, but they're creating some sort of fruit. So let's talk about the gymnosperms first, because these are, I would say, more primitive than the angiosperms. There's quite a few different phyla, but we're really going to talk about two, because these are two that you've probably seen before. So as I mentioned before, they don't have flowers, they don't have fruits. We refer to them as naked seeds, meaning they produce seeds, but there is no protection for that seed, such as a fruit. When we look at a gymnosperm or a pine tree, we are seeing the sporophyte, and we'll talk about that life cycle in a little bit. So the first phyla we'll talk about is Coniferophyta. If you couldn't guess from the name of it, these are our conifers. Conifers are cone-bearing trees. For the most part, you got your pine trees, fir trees, spruce trees, really any tree you see at Christmas, those are considered a pine tree. Some people also call these evergreens. Evergreen could be an angiosperm as well, but it is typically our conifers. So the conifers are the ones that are making the cones. These are what we're most familiar with. We even have a couple of them on campus. Another phyla I want to mention, I don't think we have one on campus, but we definitely have them here in the area, is a phyla called Ginkgophyta. Ginkgo is the name of the genus. In this case, ginkgo, a ginkgo tree is a ginkgo biloba tree. And I mentioned ginkgo biloba just because you can actually buy ginkgo biloba pills. Apparently they're good for memory. But it's actually kind of sad because this species, ginkgo biloba, is the only species in its phylum. So kingdom phylum, it's the last one. So it's kind of special. And the leaves are very unique. They have this kind of fan shape. And there's really no other tree that has this distinguishing feature. So if you're out and about and you see this fan-shaped leaf, that tells you this is a ginkgo tree. They're actually really common in parks and stuff because they're just pretty, but it's always the male tree. The females do create a nut that smells like really bad. It's not a real fruit, but it smells really, really bad. So they only plant male ginkgo trees. Fun fact for you. So here's the life cycle. Now I know you like it when I draw the life cycle, but drawing with my mouse is going to be impossible. So I will kind of highlight things along the way. I'll do a little bit of drawing, but it's not going to be that good. So I'll start with the sporophyte. So the sporophyte, remember in this case, is going to be the thing we see. It was only mosses where the sporophyte was smaller and that it was dependent on the gametophyte. So our sporophyte is this pine tree. And what you should know is whether it's haploid or diploid. So hopefully you've remembered that our sporophyte is diploid. And no matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about ferns or mosses or trees, whatever, the sporophyte will always, always, always be haploid. And then what the pine tree is going to do is it's going to make spores. Now this is where it gets kind of weird for our seed plants, and this is actually where it gets beneficial for these plants. So the sporophyte makes seeds. The seeds are happening inside of two different structures on the pine tree. There are both female cones. So this is the female. And male cones. On the next slide I have a real life picture of what these look like, but you've actually seen both of these. So the spores are created inside the cones. And these spores will grow into the gametophyte in the cones. So the cones have both the spores, and remember spores are going to be haploid. Those spores created by the sporophyte, this was done through meiosis. Now, in all the other phyla, what we saw is that these spores that get released into the environment and then grow into the gametophyte. That is not the case for seeded plants. Instead, the spores remain on the plant, whether it's gymnosperms or you'll see this as angiosperms. They stay on the plant. Now, you are a spore, and this spore just grows into the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is found inside of the female cone. So the female gametophyte in the female cone, the male gametophyte in the male cone. And so here this is showing female spores into female gametophyte. Again, this is going to be N. This is going to be haploid. Here the male spores grow into the male gametophyte. This is also going to be haploid. Now in our seeded plants, that male gametophyte is pollen. So you know pollen, you've heard of pollen. So pollen, all it was is it was a spore that turned into a gametophyte. So you have that gametophyte. The egg, or the gametophyte on the female pine cone, develops the egg, and the egg stays there. So you know trees pretty well. If you have allergies, you've experienced the release of that pollen into the atmosphere. So this gametophyte is what is traveling around. It is not the sperm. Remember, we saw with mosses and with ferns that the sperm had to swim to another plant. But that's not the case here. It is the gametophyte that has to land somewhere, and then that sperm is released. So very, very different from our ferns and mosses, and why the seeded plants have a leg up, because they don't need that water. They are able to disperse their gametophytes over wide distances and therefore be able to pollinate another plant. So this male gametophyte is released into the air, and eventually it finds its way to a female cone. And that's what's showing here. So here's this pollen, and it has found a female cone. It has found that female gametophyte. Now, as the pollen gets on the outside of this egg, this pollen, which again is the male gametophyte, is going to make its gamete. And remember, its gamete is sperm. So the male gametophyte is kind of showing it over here, releases its sperm, and that sperm is going to bore through down to the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte has created an egg at this point. So the egg is just sitting in the female cone waiting to be fertilized. The male gametophyte comes. Once it lands, it's going to release the sperm that is within that pollen grain, which is within that male gametophyte. And that sperm is going to make its way through this shell, so to speak, into the egg. All right, it's made it into the egg. Here's this egg growing and growing. And then you finally have a seed. So all the seed is, it is a egg that's been fertilized. So what does that make it? It's an embryo. And in this case, our embryos are seeds. And this is going to be haploid or diploid. Hopefully you should have said diploid, because remember, diploid, we've had the egg and the sperm. Their DNA has come together. So this is 2N. So because the gametes have come together, remember, they grow into the sporophyte. That seed lands somewhere, it gets into the soil, conditions are great, and it starts growing. So again, the overall life cycle is the same. It follows that alternation of generations, that generic cycle. But as you can see, there's some little changes along the way. The biggest one being that spores remain on the sporophyte. They do not leave. They automatically, they go through a couple days of maturation before they turn into the gametophyte. The male gametophyte is released to find the female gametophyte, which is still on the pine tree. Once that male gametophyte lands near a female gametophyte, the sperm is released to pollinate or to reproduce with the egg that is inside the female gametophyte. Now we have an embryo. That embryo is diploid. It's a seed. It's going to land somewhere and start over. So you have those worksheets of the life cycles that I gave you. More than welcome to write all over those. So this is what the male cone looks like. So you've seen these on trees. Usually don't see them on the trees, usually after they have fallen off. This is a microscopic scale of one of these male pollen cones. These sacs, these are just sacs and sacs and sacs of pollen grains. And again, as a reminder, pollen grain is the male G, so male gametophyte. So these are all male gametophytes. The pine cones that you know, those are actually all female cones. At the base of each of these leaves, as they call them, there are seeds. And they might be fertilized or not fertilized depending on where they're at. So there's like a primitive seed, essentially just waiting for the pollen to reproduce with it, to fertilize it, before it develops into a fully matured seed. So this would be a really good question on the test. I might say, the pine cone that you know and love, is that a female cone or a male cone? You should definitely know that's a female cone. I could give you a picture as well.